Welcome back to Five Sisters Zoo, everybody. I'm delighted you've decided to tune in again today. I really hope that you enjoyed Tuesday's lesson on teeth, diets and food chains. This is the second part of that lesson and we are starting off where we left off last time. We are in front of our Scottish wildcat enclosure. So in this enclosure right now, we have 5 Scottish wildcats. Morag, Fletcher, we've got Aaron, Jura and Harris as well. Now Ara, Jura and Harris were all born here just last year. Morag and Fletcher have been together, they're a breeding pair for the past couple of years, and we are so excited here at Five Sisters Zoo to be part of the Scottish Wildcat breeding programme. And in a minute or two, I'm going to be joined by Gary, our head carnivore keeper, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the Scottish Wildcats that we have in this enclosure and about why it's so important that we're part of that breeding programme. But first, I just want to tell you a little bit more about what we're going to be speaking about in today's lesson. Last time we introduced 3 new words: herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, and we spoke about what each of those words meant and the kinds of diets that a carnivore would have, a herbivore would have and an omnivore would have. This time round we're going to be looking at food chains, so the flow of energy between animals, and we're also going to be having a little look at food webs as well, which are a little bit more complex than those slightly more simple food chains. Now, I'm going to introduce 2 more words right now. Those words are producer and consumer. Within a food chain or a food web, we have producers and consumers. Producers are things like grasses and plants that use sunlight to create their own energy. Consumers, animals like ourselves, they get their energy from something else. So a rabbit, for example, is a consumer because it's going to eat grass. And then the Scottish wildcat that comes along and eats that rabbit is also classified as a consumer. So remember those words, producers and consumers, because we're going to be using those 2 words a lot throughout this session. So, back to the wildcats. We are really lucky to be joined by Gary, our head carnivore keeper, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the Scottish wildcats that we have here at Five Sisters Zoo. Thank you very much for taking some time out of your busy schedule, Gary. Can you just tell us then, what is the difference between a Scottish wildcat and a cat that somebody would have at home?
So there are a number of differences between them. The size for a start, wildcats are generally quite bigger. They've got a more robust head and the markings as well. So these guys have got very distinct markings. They've got a very banded tail and a really sort of blunt end. So I mean that's quite a big difference between your sort of domestic cats.
Excellent, because that is the one thing that we get asked a lot when people come down to the zoo. They'll see the wildcats in here and they'll notice that they are strikingly similar to cats that some individuals might have at home. So that's really good to know. And can you then tell us a little bit about why this breeding program is so important? What is the problem in the Highlands right now? Because wildcats haven't been doing very well in their native habitat for a long time, and why is that? What's been going wrong for them?
So I mean historically, things like habitat loss and persecution. So these guys would have been shot many years ago, and that was a big reason behind the drop in numbers. But more recently, hybridisation. So these guys do breed with sort of the domestic cats, and they create these hybrids. So yeah, more recently that's been the biggest issue with the kind of decrease in numbers.
Okay, well we are really excited that the individuals that we have in this enclosure are part of that breeding programme, which is going to be really helpful for boosting population numbers in the future and hopefully saving the Scottish wildcat from disappearing entirely. So that is some really exciting work that we are involved with. Now, the Scottish wildcat is a prime example of a carnivore. These guys, as I briefly mentioned earlier on, are normally going to be eating things like small mammals, small birds, and they play a really important role within a food chain. What we're going to do now, guys, is we're going to head across to another cat species that we house here at Five Sisters Zoo to have a little bit of a chat about their role within a food chain and how they may have played an important part in a food chain right here in Scotland, but not any time recently, because they went extinct here around 1300 years ago. We're going to head across to our lynx enclosure. So to take a look at a different carnivore that plays a really important role within a food chain, we've come across here to our Eurasian Lynx enclosure. We have one Eurasian Lynx here at Five Sisters Zoo, and his name is Chef. Now, unfortunately, you can't see much of him just now. I believe he is in one of his indoor dens at the minute. He might come out, but don't worry, we are going to leave you guys with a little bit of footage in a couple of minutes' time. The Eurasian Lynx is an incredible animal. There are 4 different lynx species on Earth. The Eurasian lynx is the largest of them. So we've also got the Iberian lynx, the Canadian lynx, and the bobcat too. All lynx species are small cats. They belong to the small cat family. So despite the Eurasian lynx looking quite large, they are not a member of the big cat family like leopards and lions. They are small cats. And they are definitely carnivores. In fact, they're what we call apex predators. So nothing is going to try and eat them, but they are certainly very good at hunting and eating other animals. So they are consumers and they are apex predators. And I've brought along a replica lynx skull. So it's not a real one. Remember the last lesson that we had on Tuesday, we looked at a wolf skull, a wallaby skull, a bear skull too. This is a replica lynx skull, and you can see that they have these very sharp, very pronounced canine teeth that they'll use for stabbing and tearing. They've also got these very kind of sharp teeth towards the back of their mouths, just like the wolves do, that they'll use for slicing up all the meat that they are going to eat. Now, I mentioned that the Eurasian lynx is very important within their food chain. These guys are going to be hunting things like rabbits. They might hunt small birds from time to time as well, but one particular kind of animal that they're very good at catching is deer. Now, the lynx normally hunts within forested areas. That's where they like to live. And if you look at the enclosure that we've given Chef here, it's very kind of densely vegetated. It's full of trees and bushes. That's just how he likes it. That's how the Eurasian lynx likes it. These guys tend to live by themselves. They're quite solitary and they like to live in forested areas. And that's where they're going to hunt. So they're very good at hunting things like roe deer. Now, deer, like roe deer, they are also consumers. But they're certainly not carnivores. They are herbivores. They're going to go around and they're going to eat roots and tree shoots and various different bits of vegetation within these forested landscapes. And they can cause quite a lot of damage if they're left kind of unchecked. So having a few lynx around to keep their population controlled is a really, really useful thing. Now, this topic has become quite controversial of late because up until 1300 years ago, or thereabouts, lynx were living wild right here in the UK. And there has been a call from some scientists to bring these guys back. So there's been some discussion about whether or not lynx should be brought back to the UK. And that's not a matter that we're going to go into in this video much, but it is certainly a really interesting debate that I would urge you guys at home to look into. These guys though are absolutely fascinating. It's a shame he's not out and about at the moment, but when you see that footage in a couple of seconds time, you'll notice he's got these big tufted ears. So a lot of scientists think that the tufts on those ears act a little bit like whiskers almost, so it allows them to kind of sense what might be above them. They might also use them for communication as well. And they've got a very kind of short tail, which is still very important for balance when they're climbing about within these forested areas. So what we're going to do now, guys, is we've explored a couple of different carnivores that are very important within food chains. We are now going to start looking at a food web. So we're going to head down to our wildlife pond and show you a real living example of a food web in action. So we've had a look at our wildcats, we've had a look at our lynx, and we've had a chat about where they fit in within a food chain. Both species are carnivores, so they eat other animals, and both species are definitely what we call consumers. So they have to eat those other animals in order to stay alive, in order to obtain energy. Yeah? So the wildcats, for example, might go out and eat rabbits. Those rabbits, before being eaten by the wildcat, they have eaten things like grasses. Those grasses are what we call producers. So they're not consumers, they are producers, those grasses. Because plants, grasses, they are able to create their own energy. They don't have to eat something else or decompose something else in order to gain that energy. They can create it for themselves. So most food chains will start off with a producer, and then there'll be several consumers that will follow. We've come down to our wildlife pond now to try and illustrate something slightly different for you guys. We are going to have a little look at the food web that exists within this pond behind me. Now, we're not doing this at the best time of year. It is January, it is very cold, and as you can see, most of the pond is currently frozen, so there is some ice covering this pond just now. So we might not find all that much in there just now, but guaranteed there is still a lot of life in there at this moment in time. If we were to come back down here in the summer, it would be much easier to illustrate this to you guys, but we're going to do our best anyway. So I've taken something called a kick sample from this pond. So it's a sample of water and vegetation that I collected in this net just a little while ago. Now, you guys at home, please be super careful. Don't go doing this by yourself, certainly not at this time of the year. When water is frozen like this, it isn't always very safe, so make sure you are staying nice and safe around frozen water, ponds, rivers, and places like that. They can be very, very treacherous, so don't go out and try this by yourselves, please. But we have taken a kick sample, we collected that safely, and we have popped it in this tray here just now. So you can see that in this sample that we've collected from the pond, we've got some pondweed, so we've got some plants, we've got some sort of dead decomposing leaves there as well, and hopefully we also have some animal species in there too, so we're going to have a little look for them in a minute or two. So we've already mentioned that things like grasses and different plants, they are what we call producers. So you can see that this pond has lots of producer species living in it, lots of plants, and sometimes things like phytoplankton, algae within aquatic ecosystems, they are also known as producers. Now, hopefully, we also have some consumers in there too. And when we come to a freshwater pond like this one, the types of things that we might look for are things like, I don't know if you guys can see this just now, things like water slaters. Yeah, these guys are going to go around and they're going to eat all the sort of decomposing stuff lying around on the bottom of this pond. I'm sure we'll definitely have some of them in there just now. We might find things like water snails as well. Again, they're going to eat a lot of the kind of decomposing leaves that might fall to the bottom of those ponds. Then we've also got things like, well, different larvae there. So we've got mayfly larvae. They're quite often found in ponds. They're small animals. They have almost look like they have three tails kind of sticking out their back. Hopefully you can see that picture there just now. And these guys will eat lots of kind of plant material in those ponds as well. Now, we do have some more carnivorous species that we often find living alongside some of those animals that are eating leaf litter and plants. Things like water beetles. So quite often in this pond we've found things like diving beetles that will eat other small insects, and occasionally in some places they're even capable of eating fish. We don't have any fish living in this pond at the moment. This pond's actually man-made. It was only created a few years ago, so we've got no fish in there right now. But fish, quite often, they're found within these freshwater habitats, these freshwater ecosystems, and again, they play an important part in those food webs because they're going to eat lots of the small insects that might live in there. They might eat some smaller fish sometimes too, so they tend to be slightly higher up in the order of things. So they are going to be, well, they're what we call consumers, so they're going to be eating other small insects and certainly some smaller fish sometimes as well. Now, we're going to have a little look and see if we have managed to find any of the smaller animals that I've discussed already. So some of those water slaters perhaps, or maybe some water snails. And those animals belong to a huge group known as the invertebrates. So animals that don't have any spine. And we're going to talk more about invertebrates in next week's sessions. But I'm going to have a little look about in this sample just now. You would be amazed at the things that you can find in a small freshwater kick sample like this one here. So it looks like we have a couple of freshwater slaters there. So hopefully you guys can see them in that little dish that we've got. So these guys tend to live down near the bottom of the pond here, and they'll be eating all those decomposing leaves, things like that. Now occasionally we also get birds that come and visit this pond. So things like we've got a resident heron that will come down and will stand in this pond and look for possibly small insects, small crustaceans like these guys here, these freshwater slaters. They might be looking for slightly larger things too, like those big diving beetles and possibly big snails too. So the food webs within an aquatic system like the pond that we have here are very, very diverse. It can be very large. There's lots of species in there eating other species, and there'll be lots of different producers. The clearest way to think about a food web is there's normally, instead of in a food chain where we have one producer leading to maybe one or two different consumers, in a food web there's normally lots of producers, so lots of plants or grasses or phytoplankton, for example, like in this pond here just now, that will be eaten by lots of different species, which in turn may be eaten by several species themselves. Yeah, so food webs are slightly more complex than food chains are, but they are very, very exciting, and I totally advise you guys, when we come into the warmer weather, if there's anywhere nearby where you can go and do some safe pond dipping, maybe with your parents or with a responsible adult, I totally advise you guys going out and trying it, because some of the wildlife that you find living in freshwater ponds and rivers like the pond that I have behind me here just now is absolutely breathtaking. You wouldn't imagine that you would find much in there, but it is absolutely brimming with life. They are absolutely incredible, and seeing a food web in action is absolutely stunning sometimes too. So, we're coming towards the end of the second part of our teeth, diets and food chains lesson. Today, we've spoken a lot about producers and consumers and the differences between those two very different kinds of living things. We've had a little look at some food chains. We've had a look at a food web in action, and we also discussed briefly why some of those apex predators within food chains play a really, really important role. Now, we've come up here to our lion enclosure. This is somewhere that we've not been in any of our videos before, because we're going to be coming back here next week at some point. Next week, we are going to be talking about all things classification. So we're going to be talking about mammals, reptiles, birds, fish. We're going to be talking about amphibians, invertebrates, the difference between invertebrates and vertebrates. We are going to be talking all things classification next week. So, before we finish up, I am going to leave you guys with a short clip filmed by Barclay, who sent in a video to us just a few days ago. It is a fantastic presentation by Barclay all about mountain habitats. Please remember, guys, send across your drawings, send across your presentations. We love seeing them. Stay safe, and we'll be back next week with our classification classes. Thank you.
My name is Barclay and I'm in primary 4. I want to talk about the mountain habitat. Mountainous regions are stony, rocky and steep. Some have snow on them, which some animals have adapted to cope with life in these regions. For example, snow leopard, it has a long tail to help with balance, small ears to reduce heat loss, and thick furry feet to prevent sinking in the snow. This helps snow leopards to survive in the mountains.